better.
Hey, as soon as you walk into my house, I've got a poster that says, framed up, in this house, we worship the Lord and we all watch the St. Louis Cardinals.
Exactly. That's like the 11th commandment, I think.
Yes.
Wow, you guys are getting constitutional now. Look at you guys go.
All right, we're live, boys. Let's get started.
All right, we're back for another Saturday morning legislative update. Just a couple of quick announcements we want to go over. The FOP responses to officer-involved shootings and critical incidents training is coming up on March 10th from 6:30 to 8:30 in the evening. If you're interested, your lodge president should have the registration information. It's going to be put on by Washington, Oregon, and Idaho FOP attorneys. So that should be a really good class to get you some information as far as if you're involved in a shooting. I would recommend that all your crews that you work with, you're notifying people and talking to them, and that should be something that your crew should be watching, or at least one person from the crew may be designated to watch that and bring the information back. The other thing is we have upcoming, the Evergreen Lodge has a LEOSA qualification shoot coming up on March 28th at 1 p.m. So if you are needing to qualify for your concealed carry and you're a retired officer, if your department's not providing you with that, or if you've moved to Washington from somewhere else, this is something that you can attend. There's a small fee, but again, the lodge president should have that information they can get out to you. So back again with another legislative update. I'm going to let the guys that are putting in majority of the work on this take it over, and let's hear what they have to say. So Michael, Shrimp, go ahead, guys.
Hey, James, I want you to introduce anything or just kind of start off if there's anything you want to start off with at a high level, and then we can just get right into the bills that are noted.
So thanks, Michael. I just want to say we're into that part of the legislative process where it's more like a day-to-day grind. We've hit the first cutoff of bills, so we know what the playing field is. We know what bills are moving. Michael has taken on the yeoman's share of testifying today, at this time. And so it's just right now, it's a lot of meetings, a lot of long nights, meeting with legislators. Luckily, knock on wood, that we are having a lot of good conversation, and we're getting a few things that we need to get. We've kind of distinguished ourselves a little bit. We've taken a different stance. And so on a couple of things that we'll talk about later, but again, know this, your legislative team has really been working hard, and we're going to keep at it until the end of session.
Well, thank you, sir. James is right, and I'll just kind of, as I always do, put a finer point on the schedule that we're on. So last Monday, this past Monday was what's called Policy Committee cutoff. And that's the day where all policy bills that are introduced into the legislature have to be moved out of and adopted by their respective policy committee, or else they technically become dead for the session. You may recall on previous Saturday mornings where I've talked about necessary to implement the budget. That is the big caveat and the one exception to all of this in terms of policy deadlines. And then, so this week, because of that policy cutoff committee meeting day on Monday, the Appropriations Committee and the Ways and Means. Now, there's a background. The Appropriations Committee and the Ways and Means Committee, Transportation and Capital Budget and Finance Committees have all been meeting because their fiscal committee first cutoff is this coming Monday. And what that means is that all bills that are in budget committees this week have to be moved out of the budget committees by Monday. most people say 5 o'clock, but they kind of stretch it until later in the day. And then that'll be our next big cutoff. So to the extent the bills aren't out of budget committees by this coming Monday, they'll be considered dead as well. So again, with the big caveat of necessary to implement the budget. So this coming Monday will be fraught with budget committee hearings. They will go all day. They will be mostly, if not exclusively, in what's called executive action, which means they will be taking votes on bills. I don't think anybody except one committee, as I recall, has a public hearing this coming Monday. So, and that will entail coming out, and typically is what they do is they'll come out in committee in session and run, vote on about 10, 15 bills, then go back into caucus, then come out, vote on another 10 or 15 bills. And it's going to be interesting to watch and see how that process occurs in a virtual world and how clunky it is. So with that, as James mentioned, this past week, we've had, I think, probably upwards of 15 or 20 meetings with legislators, give or take, on all the reform bills generally. And then also trying to kind of focus on a little bit of the moderate Democrats to see if there's some folks that we can talk to on that side of the aisle to moderate the approach on some of these pieces of legislation. So with that, this past week in the legislature, just, kind of at a really high level, as I mentioned, Monday was the cutoff for policy bills. And then this coming Monday is the fiscal cutoff. And that will leave exactly 15 days, Tuesday through the following Tuesday, to pass bills off of the House and the Senate floors. So after this coming Monday, the House and the Senate will both go into virtual session and begin passing bills off of the House and Senate floors. There will be both policy bills and budget bills that pass off. But remember, a lot of the budget bills, while they're moving and state a certain policy, there is, a big caveat on that in terms of funding. I will tell you that most of the bills, if not all of the bills that are moving out of the House Appropriations Committee are having attached to them what's calling a funding out clause, which means that basically if the money is not in the budget to fund a particular policy, that the bill or the policy is null and void. So you'll hear me talk a little bit about that here over the next several weeks in terms of funding the policy bills that are moving along. So just a couple of really high level things that the legislature considered this past week. Excuse me. Representative Lauren Davis, who had House Bill 1499, and that's what's called the Pathways to Recovery Act. And while it has a lot of substance use disorder things in it, it also has the decriminalization of a lot of different controlled substances, creates a committee to determine personal use amounts and such. While that bill moved out of committee, it's really got a bumpy road ahead, I think. Particularly with the combination of both the decriminalization and the substance use disorder processes that are in it. The other thing I'll mention is Representative Orwell, House Bill 1477. She's got a piece of legislation that creates a new tax on phone lines. And is what the tax does is to build infrastructure for an enhanced and expanded 988 service, similar to what the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline does now. So that's a piece of legislation that she's really interested in and that's moving forward as well. The governor has request legislation with regard to capital gains that's moving along, and that's in the Senate, Senate Bill 5096. It was voted out of the Senate Ways and Means Committee as a substitute and in a little bit different form than what it was introduced. As introduced, it was a 9% capital gains tax on gains sold by individuals exceeding $25,000 for a single person and $50,000 for folks filing jointly. And the bill was amended to reduce that amount to 7%. and it took the threshold for both single to married jointly to 250,000. So it significantly reduced the amount of revenue that it would bring in from, I think, 1.7 billion over a 4-year period to about 350 million each year. So significantly pared back. What I would note politically on that bill is that 2 moderate Democrats on the House Senate Ways and Means Committee, Senator Mark Millett, who's up from the Issaquah area, and Senator Kevin Vandeweghe, who's over on the peninsula, both voted without recommendation out of committee. So one more vote on the D side to hold that bill up out of committee, and it would not have passed. So again, finally, I'll just reiterate that once we get through this Monday, there'll be 15 days for floor action. And it'll be interesting to see how all that goes in a virtual world. So James, anything I missed from your perspective, kind of at a really high level what the legislature did this week?
No, you're doing good.
Right on. All right, so and James, you send out the agenda so everybody knows kind of the bills we're going through and such. So I'm just going to go from the top of the agenda on down, and I'll kind of pause just kind of at each one to see if you've got anything on your phones or in the chat or anything, and then we'll get through them all, and I'm happy to answer any questions either as we go through or at the bottom. So the first bill I want to talk about is House Bill 1202. And remember, this is the piece of legislation that creates a civil cause of action for peace officers in Washington State. We think that this bill has come a long way from when it was introduced. We think that Representative Ty, who's the prime sponsor, has done a yeoman's job at representing our interest and taking our thoughts into account as she went through talking about this piece of legislation. So what we're still asking for a couple of minor amendments, in my view, minor, and maybe some other views is not so minor, as it relates to the Attorney General's authority to initiate actions against law enforcement agencies and peace officers for lack of training and patterns or practices that would be inappropriate in terms of not keeping up with training requirements, not keeping policies, up to date and that sort of thing. We think that section is a little bit of a bridge too far because it really doesn't have much to do with what I would call civil remedies in law enforcement area. So we're going to continue to suggest that section come out, and we're also going to continue to suggest that a prevailing party, not a prevailing plaintiff, be entitled to attorney's fees for a successful defense or a successful lawsuit. Remember, this is a bill that has in here defenses for officers who, for civil liability, who are following training policies or are acting at the direction of a supervisor or doing behavior that's condoned by a supervisor. So, and what that does is that holds, we believe, the public agencies to a little bit higher of a standard. And if they aren't doing the right thing and we are doing the right thing, they can be held independently liable. I would note that at the public hearing, we were the only law enforcement group that was supportive of the legislation moving forward. All the other law enforcement groups, and in particular, the local governments, cities and counties, as you can well guess, who are now going to be liable for some of their inactions or inadequacies in their training and policy development, are going to be held liable. So they all were in opposition to that, which I thought was expected, but also interesting. They talked a little bit about how things won't go to trial, and now matters will be more likely to settle, which I don't necessarily view as a bad thing from an officer perspective. So that bill passed out of the House Appropriations Committee on mostly a party line vote, 19-14. Let's see, the 18th, that would have been Thursday. And again, there was passed out as it moved out of the Public Safety or the Civil Rights and Judiciary Committee with one amendment, and that was the funding out clause that I talked about earlier. That was hung on the bill by the House Appropriations Chair, Tim Ormsby. So James, anything on on House Bill 1202?
No, I think he covered it pretty well. I just, all I would say is trust us, we're moving forward. We're fairly confident, at least with this bill. There's a lot of dialogue with the sponsor and continued dialogue. So I'm fairly confident that as long as we stay the course, we're going to have a more positive outcome.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, next bill, House Bill 1310, and this is the permissible uses of use of force by peace officers and corrections officers. And I'll caveat that last statement here in a second. So in the policy committee in public safety, there was an amendment before the bill passed out that removed corrections officers completely from the bill. So the use of force standards that are in this piece of legislation would not be applicable. To corrections officers. We in committee signed up as other and it kind of leaned into support a little bit because we were very happy with the way the bill passed out of the Public Safety Committee, removing Section 6, which changed the reasonable officer standard that's in current law to a lesser standard that we didn't like, an imminent threat standard without the reasonable peace officer standard. And so the bill took, from our perspective, a pretty decent turn for peace officers as the bill moved out of committee. So we're trying to be really careful to, kind of thread a needle and keep advocating for the bill moving forward and keeping that Section 6 out, while at the same time keeping our eyes on Section 3, which does have some use of force standards in it that we'd like to see massaged, for lack of a better way of putting it, just a little bit. And then the last amendment we're going to continue to ask for is that the Attorney General is to create model policies as it relates to use of force. And we're suggesting an amendment that also asks the Attorney General to recommend state standards on the use of force. Because I think you've heard us talk about a lot on these Saturday calls about, not wanting to delegate a lot of things to state agencies. A lot of times when things go to rulemaking or go to model policy development, things don't come out the way the legislature intended. So what we've been advocating on this and other bills is that if you're going to adopt model policies, what you also need to do is recommend to the legislature statewide policies that will set the floor or the ceiling for a particular item, so that there are, at least from a statutory and a state perspective, some consistencies that can be had statewide throughout each agency. We think that's important for consistency. Does away with some of the local interpretations that, a lot of times put us at odds with the community groups. So we think having some statewide standards on some of this stuff and on use of force is a good thing. So with that, James, anything to add on 1310? What I will say is that bill also passed out of the House Appropriations Committee on Thursday. It was substituted, and there were two amendments that were added in the Appropriations Committee. And the first one, which was the more substantive of the two, was community corrections officers were added back into the bill. And I guess I don't know if that's appropriate. Jail and in custody corrections officers are still excluded from the bill. It passed out of, again, Appropriations Committee and will be sitting in Rules, waiting over the next 15 days from Tuesday to be moved off the House floor. The last section that was added in there, like the bill just previously, was a funding out clause by Chair Ormsby, so that if funding isn't provided for in the budget, that the bill becomes null and void. James, any ads on 1310?
No, just like Michael said, it's just like the other bill, 1202. We're continuing to have conversation with the sponsor. I'm fairly confident by the end of the day, those massages to Section 3 that have those civil use of force guidelines will get where we need to be. Again,
We're trying to soften them quite a bit without at the same time torquing people out so that they don't listen to us anymore. So we got Section 6 out of there. So we're just trying to soften Section 3 as the bill moves forward. And I'll just kind of at a high level kind of talk here for a second, James. We've got right now 2, 4, 6, 8 bills on our priority list, and I'm going to add 2 more. So we got 10 bills on this priority list, and there are some big, bad, ugly ones in this list. 5051 certification, 1267 independent investigation teams. So if we can get 1310 and 1202 in a reasonably decent space, we can then turn our attention to some of the bigger and more important bills to work on. So the next bill I want to talk about is House Bill 1054, and that's the tactics bill. As we mentioned on our last call, we've been working with prime sponsor and the ranking member in the Public Safety Committee on an amendment to create a canine task force or advisory group to advise the legislature on some model policies, both at an administrative level and some policies that could be adopted by the legislature on canines. Recall, this bill started out, like many of these, in really, from our perspective, not so good shape, needing some clarification. And this is one of those bills that has had a lot of changes to it since it was introduced. The prime sponsor, Representative Jesse Johnson, I think, has been listening to us while at the same time being mindful of, the community group side as well. We should be seeing a floor amendment that'll take care of the canine issues, the canine work group. And I think also they're going to have one amendment that deals with some of the tear gas, section that softens it up a little bit. I know that there are some other law enforcement groups that continue to be concerned about the differentiation between the words armed and armored vehicles. I don't particularly share those concerns as much, and think the bill is pretty straightforward in terms of acquiring federal equipment that is armored is okay, but not armed, meaning, you could take a vehicle that's just, armored around the outside, that sort of thing. And, but you can't bring a vehicle that has a machine gun on top. So we think that bill is getting really, really close to being to a place where we can accept it. Going back a couple of Saturdays ago, recall that, we have it on pretty good advice that the defense of necessity will be available as this bill perks through. And while we didn't quite get that piece to where we needed it, it's something that we think we can continue to work on and see if we can get in as the bill moves forward. So the tax sticks bill is on the House calendar on second reading. And second reading means that, let me step back. When a bill goes out of a committee and ends up in the Rules Committee, I think a couple of Saturdays ago, I talked about the Rules Committee sort of being the gatekeeper. And once a piece of legislation goes in the Rules Committee, it basically has to be voted on twice in the Rules Committee before it can become eligible to be acted upon by the full floor of the House or the Senate. And in my world, we call that you need 2 bumps in rules to get a bill onto the floor calendar. So 1054 was moved to the second reading calendar day before yesterday. So it's now eligible to be considered by the full House. And again, we do expect the K-9 amendment that's being developed between Representative Johnson and Representative Mossbrucker to be offered. And we believe that that'll put us in a place to where we can just continue to watch and monitor that bill as it goes through the rest of the process. So, James, anything else on 1054?
Good to go. You're covering it as always.
All right. All right. House Bill 1203. This is the Community Oversight Boards bill. And remember, this is a bill that seeks to mandate at the local level community oversight boards. By and large, it's got some things in there that we don't think are appropriate for community oversight boards. And specifically, those are and this bill gives those community oversight boards the authority to do their own investigations on citizen complaints, be present at investigation scenes that are conducted by their local law enforcement agency, subpoena power to subpoena officers and to hold hearings as it relates to citizen complaints, and not quite to discipline, but awfully close. The bill also contains sections to give these folks they give local community group the authority to hire and fire local police chiefs and sheriffs, and mandates that their budget be 5% of whatever the law enforcement agency's budget is in that particular jurisdiction. And as soon as I said that, I'm just going to caveat that. I believe that language stayed in the bill on the mandatory funding amount, but I'm not 100% certain. So just let me caveat that one just a little bit. And that bill continues to move forward. Again, we're advocating that those subpoena investigatory hearing authorities come out. We're totally okay with those community oversight boards being involved in creation of law enforcement agency policy. I know in Tacoma, their board looked at their body cam RFP that they were going to put out, and they're looking at the body cam policies and making recommendations on those. So those sorts of things, and making recommendations on who ought to be a police chief is okay. But this bill goes a little bit too far in terms of the investigatory and administrative things and authorities that are given at the community oversight board level that we just can't agree with. And as you can well expect, the WASPIC and the cities and the counties are fit to be tied, and really just don't want this sort of mandate thrust upon them from the legislature. So the bill, at least from that standpoint, has a lot of opposition, not only from the perspective of having an additional layer of oversight, but also mandating 5% of a local law enforcement agency's budget be used to fund community oversight boards. And boy, in a small city or town, that's probably not too much, but in a larger metropolitan city or county, 5% of the law enforcement agency's budget is going to be ginormous. So we're going to continue to advocate that the stuff I mentioned come out, and that the policymaking stuff move forward, and we'll watch the cities and the counties as they continue to push back on this piece of legislation. This bill passed out of the House Appropriations Committee last week, or Thursday of this week, without amendment. So there's lots of folks opposed to it, and we'll see if it makes it over the finish line. James, anything on 1203?
Yeah, just I do believe the prime sponsor amended it, and I think that was in the policy committee, to where it raised the size of the department, the requirement from 10 officers to 15 and above had to have these. And so that, and the reasoning behind that, that just shows is a little bit of willingness to work with law enforcement is half the departments in the state are 15 and below. So it has to be above 15 in order for this to take effect. And the other thing I would say, as far as the counties and cities, on a different criminal justice note, a lot of the sentencing reform bills are pushing a lot, if they were to pass, would put a lot of unfunded mandates onto specifically counties when it comes to having to house people, reducing how they recalculate good time, and how they, before they can actually go to a DOC facility, increasing that time means that they have to be housed at a local facility, mainly paid for by counties. And so that means more cost to the counties and the state as they pass some of this sentencing reform stuff is really not helping the counties out at all. So they're facing a bunch of what they would call unfunded mandates. So this is just a pile on, and that's something to consider as we move into the budget phase of the legislature.
Fair enough. Appreciate that. And I just looked at my notes, and that 5% mandatory funding was removed, and it was replaced with some local government flexibility in terms of funding the oversight board. So that probably softened the counties' opposition. I'm going to move on to House Bill 1267, which is the Independent Investigations Office statewide bill that was introduced, at the request of Governor Inslee, and was the result of the independent police reform, or the governor's police reforms task force that James was on. This bill passed out of the House Appropriations Committee without amendment. In our humble opinion, it continues to need a little bit of work in terms of its focus on the independent investigations. Not too much, but a little bit of work. It did remove in-custody deaths from the scope of the bill. It did send those sorts of in-custody deaths to a study group, so that there's a group put together to conduct investigations, to conduct a study on whether or not additional types of investigations ought to be added to the independent investigation team's bailiwick. This is probably helpful for their fiscal note as well, because that will certainly take some of the sting out of the Department of Corrections' impacts on them. The other thing it did is it mandated that the office become completely non-law enforcement officer or peace officer staffed. So within 5 years, all of the investigators on that team, on the statewide team, are going to have to not be law enforcement officers. So they did some good things. They included behavioral health specialists instead of mental health specialists, to make better the coordination with the co-responder teams and the such that a lot of you all are familiar with. And then it modified the procedures for the coordination between the local IIT and the statewide IIT. Has some provisions in there about the local agency maintaining control to protect and preserve evidence at the scene, when the local agency is to relinquish control of a scene to the statewide office, and in what sort of instances and what types of activities that the statewide team can relinquish back to the local team. So again, the bill just needs a little bit more work as we're going through. It's not in bad shape. The main point I want to make here is it does not include in it, or there is not a bill moving along that also includes the statewide independent prosecutor recommendation that also came out of the governor's task force. That's very, very important to us. We think those two policies should, must, and move together through the legislative process. Regrettably, the statewide independent prosecutor bill, House Bill 1507, was introduced late. And as such, it got caught up in a little bit of um, uh, committee drama last Friday. And it did not make it out of committee. So what I would tell you is just know that we are working with some of our colleagues and some folks on the community group side to see if we can't, as we go through the rest of this legislative process, find a way to marry back the statewide independent investigation teams and a statewide independent prosecutor. And on the latter part, I will mention on the latter bill, I will mention that the bill is introduced, the bill that was introduced has in it some language that still allows local prosecutors the discretion as to whether or not they're going to make a charging decision in a use of force or an officer involved shooting. And our perspective has been and continues to be that should not be allowed, and that there should be a statewide prosecutor that makes all of the charging decisions. And that statewide office goes hand in hand with a statewide office of independent investigations and allows those two entities to move and work together. We think that goes a long ways to pull in the local politics, the local criticisms, and the local hiccups that we saw in the implementation of 940, 1064 and the rules, where we don't have all the local agencies, clicking along, following the same rules and regulations. So we're going to continue to work on 1267, and we're going to continue to thread that needle and find that good marriage between 1267 and 1507, even though procedurally that doesn't seem feasible, but we're going to continue to work on it and believe we have some allies that will help us get there. So with that, James, anything else on 1267?
Nope. I just want to reiterate at this time, our official position on this is that we oppose it. One of the big reasons we oppose it is the fact that it doesn't include the second piece of the recommendation, the independent prosecution. And our logic behind that, just so everyone is clear, if we had one investigative group that's doing all these, and we had one prosecutorial group that's reviewing all these, then we bring a level of consistency and we can better be equipped to serve our members and protect our members.
Yeah. Fair enough. All right. Next bill I want to talk about is Senate Bill 5051. And, we're calling it police accountability. It's called the Police Accountability and Oversight Bill. I can't help but always just call it the CERT-DCERT bill. And the reason that's not appropriate anymore is because this bill allows the Criminal Justice Training Commission to do a lot more with CERT-DCERT. And I would argue, and a lot of other folks would argue, that usurps a lot of what a local agency does with regard to investigations of officer misconduct. So this bill, as it stands right now, as it passed out of committee, I'll just say it is in really, really bad shape. It gives the Criminal Justice Training Commission way too much authority in a lot of different areas, including when it may revoke or suspend or decertify a peace officer. It's just got a lot of really not so good stuff in it. It passed out of the Ways and Committee this past week to rules. There were 4 amendments that were offered. 3 of them were taken and 1 was not. The main one that was taken was the hearings panel language that was proposed to be changed in there on a CERT-DCERT action. The makeup of those teams was increased by 2, a line officer and another community officer was added. what we pushed really hard for was getting a line officer on that panel, and thank Representative Conway for running that amendment, and that amendment was adopted. There were a couple other minor amendments. Senator Braun had an immunity amendment adopted for the oversight panels. And then Representative Conway also had an amendment that removed the CJTC's authority in the bill to suspend a peace officer's certificate. We just really think that's a bridge too far. We think that allowing the CJTC to suspend somebody's certification while an investigation is still going on with their local agency, it's just a bridge too far. It's too confusing and gives way too much authority to the CJTC. And again, my word, it just really usurps the local governments and agencies' authority for disciplining and figuring out how to best work in their agency. So it's a bridge too far for us right now. I would note that the fiscal note on this bill right now is $6.728 million a biennium. So over a 3-year period, somewhere in the $20 million range, give or take. This bill, again, has just a significant number of problems with it. And I'm not going to go into them in any great detail, but know that it does things like changes from a clear, cogent, and convincing oversight standard of review to a preponderance of the evidence, and really just does some really cruddy things as it relates to remedial training and such. So the proposed makeup of the commission in that bill is also to a place that is at a place where we've got some serious concerns of the makeup of the commission. We like the changes that it's proposing, but we think that it needs to take a little bit more balanced approach in terms of the members of the commission. And we appreciate what's in there in terms of the term limits on the commission as well. So we are going to work over this weekend and Monday of next week on putting together a really good, solid law enforcement advocacy group, and work with the Senate Republicans side of the aisle to create a united front in terms of, number one, the groups that are opposed to the legislation at a high level. And then number two, some very specific suggestions on the legislation before it moves out of the Senate. Our hope is that this bill gets some really good stakeholder work and stakeholder attention, like what's really happened in the House on a couple of the bills we noted above. So a lot more work to be done on this bill. And again, we got about 16, 17 days to do that before original House cutoff. So with that, James, I'll quiet up on that one and see if you want to fill in any of the blanks there.
I just wanted to, you probably figured it out, but this is at the top of our list. We've worked on a lot of bills this session. We've, like Michael said, we have to get them to places where we can move on and focus our efforts on some stuff that is way worse for the profession. And this is one of those bills that from the first time we read it to now, it's just, we can't get behind it. There are a few things in it, like the term limits, the makeup of the commission, and we have, thank you to Senator Conway and those moderate Democrats that helped us out with that. But that being said, this is our top priority right now, for the next 10 days, is trying to pull all law enforcement together to try to work through this bill, much like we did with 1054.
Yeah, a united front is going to be the only way, I think, to get us to a place where we can start negotiating the substance of this bill. All right, I'm going to move on to Senate Bill 5055. That's the arbitration bill of Senator Wynn's that passed. It passed last Wednesday off of the Senate floor, 41-8. And remember, this is the bill that establishes an arbitrator selection procedure for grievance arbitrations at PERC. It requires them to appoint a roster of 9 to 18 arbitrators who will hear disciplinary grievances for peace officer personnel on a rotating basis. We supported this legislation from its introduction. We think this creates a lot of great transparency for grievance arbitrations. We think it's going to create some good data at PERC, which nobody has today on all the arbitrations that go on for peace officers. So this is one of those ones that helps with transparency, helps with data collection, and helps, I think, at the end of the day, with trying to build that trust with local community groups, because it's going to be one-stop shopping for grievance arbitrations, and I think it's going to go a long way to help building back that trust. So, and I think it's good. We think it's really good for transparency purposes and consistency purposes. So, James, you want to add anything to 5055?
Nope, you hit it right on the head.
Okay. Almost the end. House Bill 1507, that's the independent prosecution bill. That's the bill I referenced up above when I talked about House Bill 1267. So I'm not going to talk about that. Just know that we're continuing to meld those two and marry those two proposals to the fullest extent. Last bill on James's list is 5453. This is the Left One, Left Two bill. It's sponsored by Senator Schessler, and it basically moves all of the excess funding in the Left One fund that's remaining over to the Left Two fund. It'll be interesting to see if the Senate Ways and Means Committee takes up this legislation. Senator Vandewey 2 years ago, was it 2 years ago? 2 years ago, worked really hard to try to bring Left Two and Left One folks together to see if there was a compromise and, some potential payouts for the Left One folks who are still, and their survivors who are, still drawing on the fund. But it was a bumpy start. And I think after about 4 weeks, 5 weeks of session, Senator Vandewey decided that it just really wasn't something that was going to come to fruition and the parties weren't going to agree. So that effort fell off. So I don't think this bill is going to go anywhere, but we'll see. And then, so I'm going to add 2 more bills to James's list that aren't on there. And James, I'm a little upset that you missed my favorite bill, 5259. Which is the data collection bill of Senator Nobles in the Senate. We've been working really hard with the Attorney General to keep this bill in a place where the data can be collected in a very robust and independent way that allows for private universities and private companies to submit a proposal through an advisory group that's created under the bill that is going to be overseen by the Attorney General. We have been communicating to legislators that this isn't going to be a cheap proposal, but we're also advocating that with all of the other things that are going on in the policy world with regard to reforms, it is hugely important to create, collect, and research data at the local law enforcement ever in a real robust way. We think having a lot of data points reported and analyzed will help with the narrative of what you all do day in and day out, and not continue to focus on those very small percentage use of force incidences that happen in your day-to-day work. So it's been a little bit bumpy trying to keep the proposal in a way or in a fashion that allows a good, robust RFP and RFQ process. But right now, I think we're getting close. Our suggested changes to the legislation have been submitted to staff through the Attorney General. And this bill is likely to be voted out on Monday on the budget cutoff, and hopefully is in a place where it's in pretty decent shape as it moves through the rest of the process. And then we just got to get it funded. And then the very, very last one I will mention is House Bill 1223, and that's the custodial interrogation legislation. James talked about that. We talked a little bit about this last Saturday. And this is a requirement to audio or video record any custodial interrogations. Clarifying language was put on to limit the scope and to make certain that it wasn't a directive for all agencies to have body cams. There are a lot of different ways to record, both from an audio standpoint and a video standpoint. Custodial interrogations. There's some administrative provisions for if a custodial interrogation can't be audio recorded or video recorded. There's some outs that agencies and peace officers can put forth that explains why a custodial interrogation just couldn't be audio or videoed under the circumstances. So that's one that we're, watching and monitoring real closely, but nothing that we've taken a position on straight away. As you can well guess, the law enforcement agencies and the cities and the counties are very concerned about the fiscal impacts of that legislation on their day-to-day operations. So again, we've got other priorities, but again, just wanted you to know that that's a piece of legislation we're monitoring real closely. So with that, I'm always amazed at how close we get up to 11 o'clock, starting right at 10. So I'm happy to answer any questions. And James, let me know if I've left anything out.
So we had one question on Facebook. Can you just recap 1499 real quick? I know we hit it at the first, but can you just recap?
Yeah, sure. So 1499 is a bill that's entitled providing for better substance use disorder treatment, and does a lot in terms of directing the state agencies to examine how better to make substance use disorder treatment available, the best ways and practices to do it. It's very left-leaning in terms of the substance use disorder provisions. And they're probably going to cost a lot of money. I believe that section is going to go to a sunrise review, which means it's going to be directed to a state agency to look at how much and to what extent substance use disorder treatment can be bettered. The second part of the bill, which is the most controversial part of the bill, is the decriminalization of personal use and possession of several types of drugs. And that is the one section that really threw the whole hearing last week into a tizzy. I can't remember how many people signed up, both opposed and for the legislation. There's a lot of politics circling around about an initiative on decriminalization and whether or not this was the right time for Representative Davis to introduce this bill with the two concepts included. I think that there was some support for her to put forward the substance use disorder treatment piece of it, but I think there was some consternation on putting that second decriminalization piece in it. So hopefully that clears it up on what that bill is intending to do. It's got two pieces in it, and it continues to move forward.
All right. Thanks, Michael. Hey, let's just go around the room. I want to recognize there's two other state board members on here, and we'll start with the state secretary, Steve Dills. Hey, Dills, do you have anything you want to add?
I'm good. Thanks again for all your hard work.
Chairman of Trustees, Brian Banner, you have anything to add?
Nope, I'm good.
All right. Jeff, you have anything to add?
I just want to say thank you to you guys, Michael, James, and Dills for the K9. I know a lot of a lot of people were worried about that K-9 bid, and you guys worked really hard to work through that. So I appreciate your efforts.
Yeah, know this moving forward. Thanks for bringing up the K-9 again, Jeff. One of the things that we're continuing to have conversation is to make sure we have good representation on the working group moving forward and what that working group looks like. And so Steve Dills has already been put forward as the our representative, but there has been some talk internally of the FOP that we create our own working group so that Dills has all the resources to make sure that our point of view is well taken when he hits that working group. So, Holt, you have anything?
The only thing I got is I like your flair there, James. Go Cards.
Amen.
Call that a flare. Hey, while I just pulled something up, so that the 1499 bill did pass out of the Appropriations Committee. It did, as I mentioned, create this sort of readiness report. So the SUD stuff is going to be reviewed. And then it did do some things with regard to personal use, but basically just delayed those effective dates. So that bill is still moving forward, and it'll be interesting to see what shape it takes over the next 17 days as the floor House floor considers moving it forward.
So before I let Rob take, thanks, Michael. Before I let Rob take us out, just this will be up on our Facebook and our YouTube channel, WAFOP TV, Washington State FOP. All our previous legislative updates are there as well. So if you don't have the link, we'll make sure it's up on our Facebook page. But thank you again for attending. And it's all yours, Rob.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning in again on another Saturday morning. Really want to recognize James and Michael, that the amount of work they put in on this is tiring. I know that they're spending late nights and early mornings. If they're Saturday, I know they were both up at, Michael's had 2 meetings this morning already. James has had 1. I think they started at about 6:30. So thank you guys for your tireless efforts on behalf of law enforcement in Washington State. Like James said, you can always watch these. You can go back and watch previous Saturday morning updates on our YouTube channel. And thanks again. You can tune in again next Saturday morning, and we'll get you updated. Keep in mind that as we're negotiating through these things, there's give and take all the time. So something we might mention this weekend might be back in the bill next or something like that. It's a lot like your contract negotiations. And that's what takes these guys so much time to work through it. So thank you, guys.
All right. Great days, everybody.
Saturday.
Be safe.